With me here are three of our hardworking members. In fact, they have worked, for months and months for the last, I guess 5 to 6 months to prepare for the survey, interview the polling companies that we need to hire, put tremendous pressure on them to make sure they finish on time, because as I shared with them, I said, I need this report at the conference date. Not a day late, not 5 days earlier. I want it just at that time. So they came through beautifully. So without further ado, I'm going to just quickly share with you again our three Wus. On my immediate left, Frank Wu, Chancellor and Dean of the Hastings Law School. And right next to him, Charlie Wu, founder and CEO of Megatoys. And furthest left Wu is Dr. Jeremy Wu, Senior Advisor for the U.S. Bureau. All three of them have been members of Committee 100 for many years and have always done tremendous work for our organization. So again, they're going to be sharing with you about these great findings. And let's go ahead and enjoy and see what they tell us. Thank you.
Thank you, Dominic. Let me just get this technology set up right. All right, there we go. So there are note cards on your tables. This is an opportunity for us to engage in dialogue as we go through the more than 120 pages of data. And isn't the graphic design on this just great? These numbers really jump out at you. So kudos to everyone who worked on this wonderful book. As we go through this, there's an opportunity for you and all of you watching via web streaming to ask your questions. And we encourage you to fill out those note cards or to tweet us. There are runners in the room who will gather the note cards from you. The three of us will just give you an overview of this fascinating study. As you probably know, C100 has been in the survey business since 1994. So we're able to take a look at the trend lines over almost 2 decades now. And we've pioneered the mirror survey. These are surveys conducted simultaneously in the US and China. The same questions are asked, and this gives us not just a snapshot of each country, but it shows both countries looking at each other and gives us a sense of where there is work to be done and where progress has been made. So we'll just show you a few of the highlights and the themes that come out of this study. This study really emphasizes for us the work of C100, the important bridge-building work that we, all of us in this room, have been doing over so many years, and that we must still do more of. Because the major themes that emerge here are that there is tremendous positive sentiment on each side, much more than many might think, but that there remains distrust, mutual distrust, as you'll see, and that there are significant gaps between different groups, the general public on the one hand in each nation, and those who are policymakers, who are real leaders, who are business leaders. There's a gap in these groups and how they perceive of the US and China. So turning to the data, and it's our goal that this be entirely data-driven. We're just trying to show you the facts and figures, the world as it really is. Turning to this data, what we'll do is present just a few slides that are based on the book that present the details. All of you in the room have access to the hard copy, but you can also take a look at this online. There's a great microsite, and you can actually play with some of the data yourself to see how all of this works. So I'm going to take you through some of this information. Let's start with the first slide here. Opinion Survey 2012. The work for this was done in December 2011 and January 2012, so it's about as up-to-date as it could possibly be, furthering the C100 dual mission. Here's our letter from our chairperson, Dominic. Let's move on. General impressions. So this shows how people would, in general, sort of at the top of their head, what jumps out at them about each country. And you'll see that the U.S., so all of this is color-coded. The United States is in blue and China is in red, so that you can follow this very easily. And you'll see what we did was we broke out the general public, opinion leaders, business leaders, and policymakers. Dr. Jeremy Wu will walk you through all of the heavily quantitative aspects of this, all the methodology. But you'll see here that in general, there are favorable views, and we've tracked the 07 and 05 surveys for you as well. But take a look, if you will, at the contrast between the left side of this and the right side of the slide. You'll see that the general public in the United States and policymakers, that there's a gap, that the general public actually views China more favorably than policymakers inside the Beltway, inside Washington, D.C. So that's one of the significant findings, these gaps, these discrepancies that we see. Turning then to the Chinese view of the U.S., you see almost the opposite. You see that the opinion leaders and business leaders have a much more favorable view of the U.S. than the general public. So this is a real contrast. Nonetheless, this is always a glass half empty, glass half full way to look at things. I think our consensus here, the three speakers, is it's glass half full, that generally speaking, these survey results are heartening. They're positive. They show that there is much more goodwill than campaign ads might lead you to think, and that gives us hope for the future. So those are the general impressions of each country. You can see this side by side. I'd like to thank Dr. Jeremy Wu for just tremendous work preparing all of this. This really presents this data in a wonderful format. So this is a very interesting slide. This shows the difference in a more nuanced manner between these groups. We asked, how would you describe the American public's opinion of China, and how would you describe the Chinese public's opinion of the United States? So take a look at this. On the United States side, again, look at the contrast between the left and right sides of this slide. Policymakers believe that the public has a very dim, very negative view of China, but in fact the public has a much more positive view. So what does this suggest? It suggests that the demagoguery that we see, the China bashing, that it doesn't reflect the general sentiment of the average voter, the mom and pop voter out there in the heartland, that they actually have relatively warm feelings toward China, but policymakers, for whatever reason, are convinced that there's this high level of negative feeling, which isn't there, unless, of course, they generate it. So now let's take a look at the other side, and here, too, you see this contrast where business leaders in China believe that the overall public in China has very positive feelings about the U.S., but in fact, the public doesn't feel quite as strongly. So we asked, do you feel favorably or unfavorably, or you're not sure? So on each side, there's a gap. On the U.S. side, the gap is that those in leadership roles overestimate negative feeling, whereas on the Chinese side, it's that the business leaders overestimate positive feeling. So side by side, the assessment of the general public's impressions. Now, when we look at the initial thoughts, what's at the top of people's minds here in the U.S. about China, what you find is that it's primarily food and culture and the Great Wall, that those are the images that come forth most readily, followed by the large country, large population, etc. And if you take a look at this, it suggests that the images related to those aspects of the nation, those characteristics, are more predominant than concerns about politics or trade and so on. So this is how the average person perceives of China, through a lens that has to do with food, culture, the Great Wall, the tremendous size of the population. In terms of cultural impact, we wanted to assess whether each nation and its population thinks that the other nation has had a positive impact. And here you can see that, again, generally favorable. So this is a good sign on the US side. Likewise, on the Chinese side. So here it is side by side. And then we asked about the future. We asked people to think about how things would develop over the next generation, 20 years or so. Who would be the future world superpower? Now, this is fascinating. Take a look at this. On the United States side, there is, for the general public, slightly less than a majority of the general public believes that the U.S. will remain a superpower. A little bit more confidence among policymakers, although a slight decline in each instance since 5 years ago. But China, far and away, is the leading contender. Not Europe, not Russia, India, or other nations. So it's apparent that when Americans think about who might challenge the United States for superpower status, it is China that looms large. Now take a look at this on the Chinese side. Here too, again, you see a gap. You see that, and it's the second row, that is China, that the general public in China, a majority of them, believe that China will be the emerging superpower. Yet, interestingly, opinion leaders and business leaders aren't so sure. So this set of mirror images really sheds a tremendous amount of light on how these two nations not only view each other, but view themselves. So the Chinese public is just tremendously optimistic, but opinion and business leaders perhaps slightly less so. So here it is side by side, future world superpower in what is clearly emerging as the most important bilateral tie between nations for the world. Common interests on the U.S. side and the Chinese side. You'll see that there is a sense that trade is a common interest for everyone. You'll see we have these concentric circles so that you're able to contrast the 2007 survey with the 2012 survey. But what's interesting is when you look at potential conflict, the same ties that bind are potentially the ties that separate. Because the area that is, for the United States, regarded as an area of potential conflict is trade. But take a look 5 columns down at Taiwan. So compare the blue and the red here. For Chinese, Taiwan is as important or more important than trade is for the U.S., but for most Americans, not policymakers, but for most Americans, Taiwan just barely registers as an issue. So here there's a real dichotomy. For Americans, the issue, the source of potential conflict is trade. For Chinese, the source of potential conflict is Taiwan. But everyone agrees that trade is also the mutual interest of these two nations. So that concludes my part of the overview. I'll turn matters over to my friend and colleague, Dr. Jeremy Wu, who will take you through all of the methodology and all of the quantitative details. And I know he spent a tremendous amount of time studying everything right down to the use of circles in our graphics. Jeremy?
Thank you, Frank. Boy, you're going to be in trouble for these statistical technicalities. I'll start with a couple pictures. 1972. It was taken February 29th, I believe. So it may be the 10th anniversary or the 40th anniversary, depending on how you look at it. This is taken last month, and so it's a contrast duration, a period of 40 years. A lot happened during those 40 years. There were no internet, there were no emails during the last 40 years. The picture went from black and white to color, and the smiles are still the same in many ways. One thing did happen during the 40 years is, according to World Bank statistics, China became the world's second largest economy in the year 2010. Now, if you look at the historical patterns, it took a while from 1980 until 2020, when China now takes the second position according to the World Bank GDP statistics. With this as the backdrop, as Frank mentioned, the Committee of 100 has been very active in survey research for a while, starting in the 1990s. And the last survey, the last mirror survey we conducted was in 2007. So that allows us to make some comparison in the last 5 years that would lead us to this year's survey. A little bit about the background in terms of the methodology. In the United States, the time period in terms of the survey is roughly the same between the US and China, and it was in December and January of this year. In terms of the sample size, for the 4 groups, you have the general public, which was done by random digit dialing with a margin of error of about 3%. And then the other 3 groups in terms of opinion leaders, business leaders, and then the policy makers, that includes the congressional staffers and think tank individuals. And that would range for anywhere from 244 individuals to 36, and the corresponding margin of error for these individual groups. From the Chinese side, with the assistance of Horizon, we conducted the survey through face-to-face interviews, and it requires a much larger sample size. And in total, there are over 4,000 individuals interviewed. From the general public, there were about 3,775 individuals, yielding a margin of error of about 1.7%. And then we also have the opinion leaders along with the business leaders. With the Chinese survey, it covers, it's done through so-called stratified random sampling, and it covers 12 major cities, and that would be these colored in green colors. And there are also 12 medium-sized studies, and that would be these purple color locations. And also rural areas are also covered, and that's basically the sampling approach used in China. There were a total of 75 questions in the 2012 survey. 49 of them were asked in both the United States and China, 19 of them in the US only, and 7 in China only. In comparison to the 2007 survey, about 80% of the questions were repeated. That would allow you a chance, as Frank just demonstrated, a chance for you to compare past results with the current survey. The 75 questions were divided into 6 major areas covering the overall impressions, the mutual interests and concerns, the US-China policies, trade and investment, media sources, and domestic issues. These are the 6 major categories. And in addition, these results will be reported and available in both English, simplified Chinese, as well as traditional Chinese. As Frank mentioned, these results are posted in the internet. The microsite, the URL is survey.committee100.org. Every question is posted and every response is posted in here, so you have a chance. If you missed your assignment last night, according to what Dominic has given, in studying the book, you still have a chance to catch up. And if you do have any suggestions and comments, we welcome that very much, and please send your comments to research@committee100.org. At this point, it's my pleasure to introduce you to our third co-chair partner, Charlie Wu.
Can you bring the... Thank you, Jeremy. Let me dive right into the most difficult issues that we deal with in this survey. When we start designing questions, one of the most important area that experts and policymakers told us was there was a problem of lack of trust on both sides. So this became the first category of questions that we added to this year's survey. How much do you think the US should trust China? And also, how much China should trust the US? And as you can see, on the US side, a majority of all categories of Americans feel that America should trust China a little bit or not at all, okay? And let's look at China here. Again, a majority of Chinese in all categories feel that China should trust a little or not at all of the United States. What puzzles me is that, as Frank mentioned, the business leaders, if you remember his slide, the business leaders and opinion leaders had over 90% favorable impression of this country. And yet, by a majority, the business leaders and opinions leaders don't feel that they can trust the United States. To me, I'm still struggling with that. How do you have a favorable, 90% favorable impression of a country, and yet the majority of those groups do not feel that they should trust the United States? So we're going to have some discussion later. Maybe some of you can shed some light on that. Okay. And one of the questions that we have asked in the past, and we ask again, is this question. There are two statements here, and I think that reflects how we feel about each other. The first question, statement A, says, the US accepts China's status as a rising power and wants a collaborative relationship. Statement B says, the US is trying to prevent China from becoming a great power. Okay, so this is exactly opposite of the view. When you look at the United States, okay, by a pretty large margin, Americans in all categories feel that we look forward to China's rising and we hope for a collaborative relationship, which is all very positive. And if you look at China, again, by a majority across all categories, not a majority with the opinion leader by a small margin, Chinese in general feel that the United States is trying to prevent China from rising. I guess that explains the issue of trust. You cannot trust a country if you think the other country is trying to prevent you from achieving greatness. Okay, so that's the contrast of perception. And in addition, we also asked both sides, what are some of the recommendations they would suggest for each of the countries? So the Americans are asked, what should the United States do and what should China do? And the Chinese side, we also asked them, what should the Chinese government do as well as the United States government do to improve trust? So these are some of the suggestions. Oh, there's another slide on the same page on trust. As we all know, China is the largest holder of United States bonds. And we just want to ask the Chinese, how safe do they think the investments are in American bonds? A whopping 13%. 13% of the Chinese public believe that their investment in the United States security bonds are safe. So 65% do not feel good about our debts. Okay? So I thought that was an interesting thing to throw in there. Again, this is to ask, actually, we ask the business leaders and opinions leaders, because I think they are more focused on the relationship, they have a better understanding, and they would give us a better answer. And this is not a surprising response, right? The first suggestion or the second suggestion they're pretty much tied. We want China to respect human rights. We want China to have a transparent government. We want them to be like a democracy like us. As we all know, that's the guiding principle driving American foreign policy for many years. And if you look at the third suggestion, improve fair trade. And the fourth one was intellectual property protection, as well as stop doing espionage and stealing our trade secret. So those are the 4 recommendations from the US side. If you go to the Chinese side, the first suggestion is communication and cooperation, okay? That's a very sensible recommendation. I think our survey has shown that the more the Chinese public know about the United States, either through visitation or through exchange and dialogue, the more they know us, the more favorable they become, the more favorable impression they have with us. So, promoting communication and cooperation, I think that's a very thoughtful suggestion and relatively simple suggestion. If you look at second, third, fourth, and fifth recommendation from the Chinese side, respect China, avoid interfering with China's internal affairs, stop political posturing. If you remember what the Americans suggest the Chinese should do, they should change the government, they should respect human rights just like we do, they better fix their trade policy, and they better stop doing, protecting intellectual copyright. And the Chinese, the second, third, fourth, and fifth recommendation basically said, don't tell us what to do. Okay? If you look at it, that clearly is a contrast. We tell them, if you want me to trust you, do things like we do. And the Chinese side would say, if you want us to trust you, don't tell us what you want us to do. Okay? I think that's where communication and cooperation come in. I think the Chinese public need to realize that it might not be bad intention. It is in Americans' DNA. We want to tell the world what the government should look like, and the people throughout the world need to enjoy the same rights and liberties as Americans do. I think they need to understand that is a well-intentioned policy. Okay, and the American side need to be also sensitive to the fact that we can no longer tell the world what they should do. Okay, so in terms of recommendation, you actually could see the contrast. Basically, from the recommendation, you can tell what the problems are, okay? And then let's go to the next slide. I think Frank mentioned that in general, China feels very good. Chinese feel very good about themselves. The public thinks that by 58% in 20 years, they're going to be the world's superpower. I think that's one theme that you can find in the entire survey is the confidence and optimism among Chinese people, okay? If you look at the United States side, the general public feels that 36% of the general public, of 36% of Americans' public feel that we are on the right track, okay? 36%, not an impressive number. Among business leaders, 47% feel on the right track. Business leader 48%, opinion leader 47%, okay? So again, the majority of Americans do not feel too good about the direction of our country. And when you go to China, 74% 2-1, Chinese feel very good about the direction of their country. If you think 74% is high, 5 years ago, it's 88%. So as good as Chinese public feel about the direction of the country, that's a double-digit drop. And the opinion leaders, 65%, is a drop from 89%. And the business leader, 5 years ago, pretty amazing. 95% of the business community in China felt they were on the right track, and now it's only 72%, okay? I guess there's some explanation to it. Maybe the economy slowed down, or maybe when we did the survey in 2007, that was right on the eve of the Olympics, where there was a lot of optimism, good feeling about China as it entered world stage. So there was a lot of confidence then, and still, from 74% is something that any United States administration would love to have. If 75% of the public feel that you're on the right track, and that's what China has now, 2-1 compared to Americans. I think another interesting issue to look at are the top issues. What do the Chinese think are the top issues? If you ask the general public, the number one issue is corruption. Not surprising, as those of us that know China, number one issue is corruption. The second biggest issue is jobs and the economy. As good as the economy is, the public is a little bit worried about whether the economy can sustain itself or not. When you go to the opinion leaders, the number one, actually the two issues that are tied is morality, values. I believe that is actually ethics, which, government ethics, business ethics. I think the opinion leaders are a little bit worried about, I think it's related to corruption. So I think they're a little bit concerned about lack of ethics or the translation, say, moral among Chinese. And of course, Taiwan is another issue that tied as the top concern. If you look at among the business leaders, the number one issue among business leaders is AIDS and other epidemic diseases. I think China has gone through some pretty severe epidemic, SARS, and I think the business community are really worried about how an epidemic, how a major public health crisis could really disturb the stability and impact the economy. So it's interesting that three groups, there are three different sets of priorities. So China is not a homogeneous country with one view. So you can see the three different priorities. Okay, I think a lot of us had this experience. When you talk to Chinese officials or decision makers, you ask them, we all know what the problems are. Why doesn't the Chinese government do this, do that, right? The answer has always been, China is still a developing country. There's still a lot of poverty in China, and the top priority has been and will be to feed 1.5 billion people. And that has to be the top priority, and everything else would have to wait a little bit. So our question was, and this is really my favorite slide, okay, suppose China is now the superpower. So you don't have to worry about feeding people. You don't have to worry about poverty. What would you want China to do? So this is really what is the soul and what's the value of China if you don't have poverty. And again, I think this is my most interesting slide. I need to apologize because Jeremy being so accurate, he didn't feel that the bubbles truly represent the proportion. So I'm going to so go through a different bar charts, okay? In terms of the general public, the number one thing they want China to do is to continue stable economic growth. We sort of expect that across the board, that steady economic growth and quality of life, the economic jobs, that's the number one thing they want to maintain. Not surprising. By the way, we only allow them to pick two answers, okay? And the choices are pretty, we have military issue, we have an economic issue, foreign policy, domestic equality, justice, and international aids, and that's one at the bottom I want to go to, okay? So the general public, if they think that corruption is the number one issue, other than steady economic growth, they want China to build up the military. Okay, they think corruption is number one, and yet domestic equality, social justice, rule of law is not as important to the Chinese public. To me, that's a little bit of a surprise, right? They identify corruption as the number one issue, but if they got a choice, they rather continue the economic growth and strengthen the military to protect national interests. Among the business leaders, no, there's no doubt that number one issue is economic growth. And the number two issue, this is business people now, that are supposed to be profit-driven. And the business community want domestic equality, social justice, and rule of law. It's the business community that want equality and social justice. If you believe that the business community is driving China's policy decision, then you know the priority of the business community. And if you look at the opinion lead, again, economic growth is the number one priority, and domestic equality, justice, and rule of law is second, okay? Pretty consistent with the business community. And go to the bottom, political system reform, right? In this country, we want China to have political reform. In an entire survey of over 4,000 Chinese in all categories, only one person mentioned that political reform to be of importance. That to me is the most interesting result of the entire survey. I was going to end my presentation here, but just to honor what Michael Milken and what we mentioned yesterday, I want to show you the next slide. Our thinking is that if we think China has that wonderful a future, which country do you think the young people would have the best opportunity, right? We all Chinese immigrants, we come to this country because of the opportunity for the young people. We all come for that purpose. If the public thinks that China is going to be a superpower, would they believe that? Okay. The Chinese public, by a 3-2 margin, believe that the young people of China would have a better opportunity in China than the United States, okay? I don't know whether that would drive the future immigration to this country, but when the Chinese public feel that the young people have better future in China, I think that really impacts a lot of immigrants thinking about this country versus China. But for those of us that worry about the Chinese not coming, don't worry. The business leaders, by a pretty wide margin, love to send young people to this country. I think the USC administrator is really happy to see the Chinese student, at least the business leader, continue to send the children to this country because to receive the education because we offer a better future. With that ends my presentation, and I want to give the next slide to thank all the staff and consultants involved. And I know the last several months is a lot of work. I mean, I speak for myself, has been a very demanding person, not the easiest to work with, and I take this opportunity to express my personal gratitude on behalf of the co-chairs, our appreciation for your hard work. Thank you very much.
And thank you. We now have about 25 minutes for Q&A. Again, there are note cards at your table. There are runners with signs who will come by to pick up your note cards, and I believe Mercy's going to deliver me a batch of note cards in a moment. Whenever I look at data like this, I realize my mother was right. I should have paid attention in Chinese school. All right, so these are questions from those of you in the room, as well as some other questions. Let me start with a question about methodology. And if you'd like to direct your questions to a specific co-chair, do feel free to do that. So this is a question: did you examine differences by gender or age?
Yes, we do.
So, Charlie, Jeremy, do you want to speak to this question?
The demographic factors were also collected in the survey. In the consideration of time, we have given you basically the so-called top line results. So more detailed analysis is entirely possible in terms of comparing gender, even geographic locations, and other factors.
Yes, we do. Particularly in our Chinese survey, we even identify Communist Party members versus non-members, different age groups, and there are differences. But just for those that wonder, what's the difference between party members versus non-party members? Actually, Communist Party members, in general, have a more favorable impression of the United States, are more identified with the American values. I believe that the party members actually have access to more information about this country and more often come to visit this country than the general public. It is because of that interaction that actually Communist Party members have a more favorable impression of the United States and what we stand for. And that to me is kind of a little bit of a surprise.
Okay, another methodology question regarding the category of policymakers. Was this actual senators and representatives, or was this staff?
These are primarily high-level congressional staffers, including legislative directors, chief of staff, and also this year we all included think tank executives also in the policymaker category.
This question is: there are many differences in U.S. and Chinese opinions. How do you think we can close the gap? Charlie, perhaps you'd like to take this. You've given quite a bit of thought to...
there was in a survey question, and that's without doubt is just communication, cooperation, and context. I think actually the survey we also identified visitation. This applies for Chinese as well as Americans. Actually, in the American side, 6% of the general public had visited China. About 40% of the opinion leader, 40% of the business community visited China. For those that have changed their views about China after visitation, they're pretty clear that after visit, they become more favorable because they understand better. And the same also applies to Chinese. And only 2% of the Chinese public has visited the US. Surprisingly, among opinion leaders and business leaders, over 40% have come and visited the United States. It doesn't matter where they come from, what party affiliation they have. After they come to the United States, after they learn about this country, they become more favorable. So it's communication, cooperation, and interaction. That's really the key, and it's throughout the survey we find that trend.
Toward that end, I'd like to mention a project that Committee of 100 itself is helping to support. It's the newly formed U.S.-China Binational Commission on Trust Building. There are 5 Chinese members and 5 U.S. members of this important project that C100 is supporting. And we're joined today by the chair of the U.S. side. That's Dean Ernest Wilson III of the Annenberg Communication School at USC. He's seated right here in the front. So that's a practical measure that we're working on to help improve the situation with trust. The next question is about Chinese perceptions of China. And there's just a treasure trove of data here that we haven't had an opportunity to cover. You'll see that we did ask numerous questions about Chinese perceptions of China, American perceptions of the U.S. And this question is about the opinion in China about the Chinese government. And I think there's some data that suggests that there's a high level of willingness on the part of Chinese to criticize the Chinese government, and a change since 2007. Perhaps Charlie and Jeremy, you'd like to go into detail on that.
Actually, among this is particularly true among the business leadership and the opinion leaders. And on the issue of U.S.-China relationship, obviously, both sides are not very happy with both governments, okay? That's the bottom line. Surprisingly, among Chinese, business leaders and opinion leaders, by a pretty overwhelming margin, are very critical of the Chinese government's handling of the relationship. Of course, they are just as critical, if not more so, against the United States government of handling the relationship. That's another issue that we discussed, which we have not mentioned in our report today, is the environmental issues. Again, the Chinese business leadership and the opinion leader are quite critical of the Chinese government of handling of the environmental issue. And of course, the United States, the American public doesn't really feel that the Chinese are doing well at all in handling this issue. But again, that is another area where both sides are quite critical of their own government as well as the other government.
And the next question is about media portrayals and how each country receives data through the media and whether they think that media portrayals are accurate and truthful. Let me pause at this moment. You'll see someone going through the room with a sign that says questions. I really would encourage more questions. We would welcome them. I've got several more to go through here, but this is really an opportunity for us, C100, as well as guests, to talk about all of these findings and what action we as a group might be able to take. Let me turn to Charlie and Jeremy about media portrayals. What does the survey tell us about media portrayals and how each country thinks it is being portrayed?
Okay. Our survey, we did look into both in the United States as well as in China, where they get the information about the other country. I think in the United States, it's pretty traditional news outlet, televisions, newspapers, and magazines. And in China, they learn about the United States mainly through internet. Okay, the Chinese learn about this country through not English internet services, but Chinese internet news websites. So that's where the Chinese learn about this country. And again, in terms of the lack of trust, across the board, both countries, whether it's general public, business leader, opinion leaders, we don't trust the other country's media, and we don't trust our own media also. The same in China, in the China side, the Chinese general public, maybe the Chinese public, 49% of the public think that they can trust the Chinese media, but among opinion leaders and business leaders, they do not trust their own media, they do not trust our media. Both sides do not feel that the media had done a good job in portraying the other country.
How has the global financial crisis affected these issues, the perceptions of China and the U.S.? And have there been changes over the past 5 years, from 2007 to 2012, in how trade is being perceived?
I think if you remember Frank's slide, the area of common interest, number one, trade. In the United States side, the second most important issue in America's mind, where we need Chinese cooperation, is global financial stability. Okay, we Americans are very well aware of that we need China at the table when we deal with global financial stability. On the Chinese side, it's really interesting that on the Chinese side, they feel that the currency dispute is something that they really worry about. And that doesn't really show up in the American side, because I think the Chinese public and business leaders have been quite threatened by the United States posturing and pressuring the Chinese side to change the evaluation of RMB. I think the Chinese feel threatened by that. And in this country, this issue has not quite in our radar screen. And it was really interesting that Frank mentioned that trade, right? Everywhere we've seen in terms of media, trade in this country is portrayed in a negative light. I think it's if you look at the survey, 3/4 of Americans actually feel good about trade. That's not to say that we don't have a problem with what's going on in terms of the deficit, in terms of outsourcing of jobs. We are very concerned about that, but overall, we feel very good about, I wouldn't say very good, we value the benefit trade, although we recognize the problem. Another area we went into with a little bit in depth was investment. It was supposed to be my slide, I don't know, I skipped over or forgot it, is that in general, Americans like to encourage Chinese to invest in this country. We recognize that's good for our economy, create jobs. We recognize it would bring the two countries closer together. But if you identify some of the problems of investment, like Chinese would gain technological information from this country, the public become concerned. When you mention about Chinese controlling our economy, the American public becomes a little concerned. So we have quite complex and sometimes conflicting views in terms of investment and trade, but in general, surprisingly, the public feels pretty positive about that economic relationship.
Okay, we have another methodological question. Someone took a careful look at the map of China and notes that the poll basically concentrates on the eastern half of the PRC. Why was that done, and would we think that there is any difference in the western part of the PRC?
There may be some difference in that regard, and for the Chinese survey, I should have added that Xinjiang and Tibet were not part of the sampling frame, along with Hong Kong and Macau. So it is, in that sense, quote, incomplete, and it does miss a certain portion, but relatively speaking, in terms of the coverage, it's not quite 100%, but it's pretty high.
I look at the data myself, it's just curiosity. I didn't really look at that carefully about geography. Usually, urban area, they are more favorable towards the United States than rural area. As a matter of fact, many respondents in the rural area still believe that Russia is their most important partner, okay, but not in the metropolitan area. And I think if you look at geographic location, I did look at the ethnicity of Chinese. Han usually feel a lot better about the government than other ethnic minorities within China. I guess when they are not as connected to the central government, they don't feel as positive about China and the relationship.
I'll add, in terms of all the quantitative questions, that is contained in the booklet and also on the website. So for those of you who really want to delve into this data, you can take a look at it for yourself. On the Chinese side, we retain the firm Horizon, which is the leading polling firm there, does quite a bit of work for the West. It is a firm that uses Western-style polling methodologies and is considered the top firm in China. The last question that we have is, to what extent will U.S.-China relations affect this year's presidential race?
I think this we step out our role as a survey personnel.
And we are, of course, a non-profit, nonpartisan group.
I think when I first looked at the data, my first reaction was we should have done some more questions on the China bashing issues, right? And because our survey did give us some hint, but it was not a direct question. We had to do it over again. Maybe this is when I appeal to Dominic and those that allocate money. If we do this again, I think we should really focus on that, how effective that political strategy of blaming China among the US political circle, right? As Frank mentioned, the elites in this country, they're pretty sure that the public is negative about China. They're wrong, okay? And from what the first thing came to mind, trade deficit is only 5% of the American public thinks that's the first thing that come to mind about China, okay? It's all the positive cultural, food and a big country. That's the American perception. So I think what happened is the elites are talking among themselves. They convince that the public is negative, so they listen to themselves about this. The public is pretty negative about China, and they think the strategy is working. And I think you're going to see more of that same strategy blaming China. But in reality, our surveys show that might not be working. And I think, let me put in the plug, I think the Committee 100 is putting out a statement cautioning the political leadership about please do not consider bashing China as your top strategy in a negative way, because the many loyal Chinese Americans and Asian Americans are affected by the stereotyping and the broad stroke of blaming China. So we will have that statement being one of our very important principal positions coming out as you go to Washington, D.C. in a couple of weeks.
That's right. We'll show you that statement in tomorrow's members' meeting. It was just recently drafted, and it's a very powerful, succinct statement. Jeremy, did you want to add on the presidential race this year?
I have a crystal ball at home. I forgot to bring it.
Jeremy has recently retired from the federal government, where he was in a very senior role with the Census Bureau. A few more questions that came in that I will get to here. President Obama is trying to create jobs. What is the U.S.-China strategy to create jobs?
I think originally Governor Brown would have been here for lunch, but I know that he has to go to a funeral of a deputy sheriff. I think if Governor Brown would have been here, he would make the appeal that the Chinese should invest in California and to stimulate our economy. He would tell you what he's doing to attract Chinese investment. Okay, I think if you follow the discussion when Vice President Xi Jinping's visit to China and also show the survey, the two things that you will hear that from Secretary Bryson later today, the two things the United States want to focus on is one, trade deficit, which is a sort of negative thing, pressure China to level the playing field. At the same time, we want Chinese investment. It's very important. Throughout California and every other state, to the mayor of Los Angeles, Chinese investment is important. To Governor Brown, Chinese investment is important. To California, I think in the national level, it will be the same thing. So we are concerned about trade deficit, but we want their investment. And you will hear that later today from Secretary Bryson.
All right.
I'm predicting that.
Here's the last question. So we're going to close the question and answer period. The last question is, what are the most important or new observations that we would offer to this audience that isn't readily apparent just from the numbers? In other words, what do you take away from all of this? And this gives our panelists an opportunity to offer their final thoughts on the Mirror Survey for 2012.
You want to go first?
Charlie?
From my perspective, especially in comparing to the 2007 results, I do see the diversification of opinions and positions in China compared to 2007. And I think earlier there was an observation about the Chinese being critical of their government more, and critical may not be the word that I would use. I think it's also introspective in some ways. I think as the public, as the opinion leaders and business leaders get exposed to an increasing amount of issues, and as the relationship between the two nations has matured over the last 40 years, I think there is a better understanding. That's why there is a multitude of issues, but at the end of the day, I think the favorable impressions are still there. There are certainly areas like trust that need to be improved upon, but it does bring home eventually that the collaboration, the cooperation seem to be the path to go. And one of the indicators would be, I would call the Taiwan question, because if you look at that 20 years ago compared to today, I think it's a lot of the lowering of the temperature and also more hopeful that more peaceful resolutions would work out. So I do see that transition or the transformation over time in terms of the opinions from the two countries and especially from China.
Okay. 3 quick points. Number 1, Americans' opinion of public opinion of China since 5 years ago, not a big margin from 52% to 55%. So I see more anti-China bashing. The public opinion has gone up a little bit, okay? See how well that works. And the negative feeling, the unfavorable impression among American public toward China has gone down from 55% to 37%. So we feel actually, the last few years, we feel negative, less negative over China. I don't think most of the policy decision makers recognize that. And number 2, on the Chinese side, as we mentioned, the Chinese positive confidence and optimism about their country is quite incredible, okay? Considering that it was now 70-some% in the right track, gone down from 90%, maybe 90% was not sustainable, but 70-some%, this country wished they had that kind of optimism from its citizens. And number 3, in terms of what are the priorities among China? For those that really think that China is going to be an international player, really want to dictate the world and all that, China actually, if you ask the public and the business and the opinion leader, they're quite introverted. They want to take care of themselves internally, domestically, more than playing big-time global politics. Okay, I think those are the 3 quick takeaways that I have.
And I'll conclude by thanking my 2 co-chairs. It's Charlie and Jeremy who did the bulk of the work on this just terrific survey. I think the most important takeaway here is there's tremendous positive sentiment, but there are also risks. And most important for us, for the United States, for C100, for all of us who care about these issues, it's clearing away the myths, the stereotypes, the preconceptions, and replacing them with knowledge and facts and increased contact. The more we know about each other, the better off we all will be. So on that note, I thank all of you for joining us at this lunch. I thank you for your support of the C100 2012 Mirror Survey. Thanks so very much.